In the fourth age of Middle-earth, when the songs of victory over the Dark Lord had grown to legend and the memory of Sauron's reign had dimmed to whispered tales by hearth fires, there came a shadow upon the lands once more. Yet this shadow bore not the malice of the lidless eye, but something far more ancient and terrible. Morwen of the Dúnedain walked the paths of Ithilien, her weathered cloak drawn close against the autumn wind. She was of the line of the Rangers, though her bloodline traced back through forgotten years to the courts of lost Númenor. In her 57th year, she bore the weight of many sorrows, chief among them the loss of her daughter Arianne, who had vanished 3 winters past while traveling the roads to Minas Tirith. The leaves of Malorn and beech rustled with an unnatural whisper as she made her camp by the banks of Celdwyn. In the dying light, she perceived a strange luminescence emanating from the direction of the Ash Mountain. It was not the red glow of Mount Doom, long since darkened, but a sickly green radiance that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. As sleep took her, Morwen dreamed of her daughter's voice calling from beyond the mountains of shadow. "Mother," came the cry, carried on winds that reeked of ancient decay, "I am held in the fortress of Torek Ungol. Come to me ere the moon wanes, or I shall be lost forever to the darkness that stirs." She woke with the taste of ash upon her tongue and the certainty that her daughter lived still, though perhaps in a manner that would bring no comfort to a mother's heart. King Elessar sat upon the throne of Gondor, his beard now silver-streaked, and his eyes bearing the weight of 3 decades of rule. The citadel of Minas Tirith stood gleaming in the morning sun, its white walls a testament to the peace that had blessed the realm since Sauron's defeat. Yet on this day, the king's brow was furrowed with concern. "My lord," spoke Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, as he entered the throne chamber with hasty steps. "The Rangers bring disturbing tidings from the eastern marches. Strange lights have been seen rising from Mordor, and several of our folk have gone missing from settlements near the Morgul Vale." Morwen stood before the throne, having ridden hard through the night to reach the city. Her travel-stained garments and wild eyes spoke of urgent purpose. "Your Majesty," she said, offering the briefest of courtesies, "I seek your leave to enter the Black Land. My daughter calls to me from beyond the Efelduath, and I would answer that call though it lead me to the very Samath Naur." The king studied her with eyes that had seen much of sorrow and loss. "Good Morwen, we have heard tell of your daughter's fate, but to venture into Mordor in these days of strange portents would be folly beyond measure. The land remains poisoned, and now it seems something stirs within those desolate borders. Then you would have me abandon her to whatever darkness has claimed her?" Morwen's voice carried the edge of steel. "I have walked the paths of peril before, my king. I do not ask for aid, only for your blessing that I might pass through your lands unhindered." Faramir stepped forward. "If you must go, you shall not go alone. I will gather a company of rangers to—" "Nay," Morwen interrupted. "This burden is mine alone to bear. Too many have been lost already to whatever evil now wakes in that cursed realm. I will not see good men die for my daughter's sake." After long deliberation, Elessar granted her request, though with heavy heart. As she departed the citadel, Faramir pressed into her hands an ancient blade of Númenorian make and a phial filled with water from the fountain of the White Tree. "May these serve you in the darkness ahead," he said, "and may you return to us with better tidings than those you carry hence." 5 days hence, Morwen stood upon the borders of the Eamon Muil, gazing eastward toward the dead marshes. The ancient paths that Frodo and Sam had traveled were overgrown now, but still passable to one skilled in the ways of the wild. Yet, as she descended into that place of sorrow, she found it much changed from the tales she had heard. The phantom faces that had once haunted those stagnant waters were gone, replaced by something far worse. From beneath the black pools rose shapes that were not mere memories of the dead, but something that lived and hungered. They whispered in tongues that predated the elder days, and their eyes burned with the same green fire she had witnessed from afar. By her second night in the marshes, these beings, she knew not what else to name them, began to follow her. They kept their distance, as if some power yet restrained them, but she could feel their malevolent gaze upon her at all hours. When she drew the Númenórean blade, they would retreat with hisses of displeasure, but they did not flee entirely. On the third morning, as she navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of bog, one of the creatures spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "Ranger of the North, you walk toward your doom. Turn back now, and we shall grant you swift passage from this place." "I seek only to pass through your realm," Morwen replied, her hand upon her sword hilt. "I have no quarrel with the dead." "We are not the dead," came the reply, and now she could see the speaker, a tall figure wreathed in marsh mist, its features shifting like water. "We are older than death, older than life. We are the forgotten, and we have been sleeping beneath these waters since the world was young. But she has awakened, she who calls herself the Lady of Shadows." At these words, Morwen's heart grew cold with a fear greater than any she had known, for in the creature's words she heard the echo of her daughter's voice. "Who is this Lady of Shadows?" she demanded, but the creature had already begun to fade back into the mist. "Ask her yourself, Ranger," came the fading voice. "She waits for you in the Tower of the Moon." The great gate of Mordor lay in ruins still, its iron teeth scattered like broken bones across the Dagorlad. Yet as Morwen approached the entrance to the Black Land, she perceived that new works had been raised from the rubble. Where once had stood the Morannon in all its terrible majesty, now rose a tower of black glass that seemed to drink in the very light of day. From its peak flew no banner of the eye, but rather a standard that bore the image of a silver moon inverted, its horns pointing downward like the antlers of some cosmic beast. Guards stood upon its ramparts, not orcs, for that race had been scattered to the winds after their master's fall, but men clad in armor of the same green-black glass as the tower itself. As she drew near, expecting to be challenged or turned away, the great doors opened of their own accord. A figure emerged to greet her, tall and fair of face, though there was something in her bearing that spoke of great age. Her hair was silver white, and her eyes held depth that seemed to reflect starlight from ages long past. "Welcome, Morwen of the Dunedain," said the figure, and her voice was hauntingly familiar. "I am Arianne, Lady of Shadows, and I have been awaiting your arrival." "See!" Morwen's sword was in her hand before conscious thought could stay it. "You are not my daughter," she said, though her voice trembled with the doubt that gnawed at her heart. The figure that claimed to be Arianne smiled with lips that were perhaps too pale, too perfect. "Am I not? Look upon me, mother. Do you not see the child you bore, the woman you raised? I am she, though much changed by the gifts that have been bestowed upon me." "What gifts?" Morwen demanded. "And what is this place you have made from the ruins of evil?" "Come," said Arianne, gesturing toward the tower. "Let me show you wonders beyond your imagining. Let me show you what lies beneath the foundations of this world, and why the One Ring was never the greatest of Sauron's treasures." Against all wisdom, Morwen sheathed her blade and followed the figure that wore her daughter's face into the Tower of the Inverted Moon. Within the tower, Morwen found chambers wrought not of stone and iron, but of the same dark crystal that formed its walls. Through the translucent surfaces, she could see shapes moving, vast forms that swam through the substance of the tower as fish might swim through water. The sight made her eyes water, and her head spin with vertigo. Arianne led her ever upward through spiraling passages that seemed to defy the laws of space and time. "You wonder at this place," said she, who had been Morwen's daughter. "It is built not merely from stone and metal, but from the very substance of dreams and nightmares. Here, the barriers between what is and what might be grow thin." They came at last to a great chamber at the tower's apex, its domed ceiling open to the sky. At its center stood a sphere of black crystal, larger than any of the Palantiri of Númenor, and within its depths swirled not visions of Middle-earth, but glimpses of realms beyond the circles of the world. "Behold," said Arianne, "the Ithildan Palantir, the star-seeing stone. It was wrought in the depths of time by powers older than the Valar themselves. Sauron found it in the ruins of ancient Angband, but he lacked the wisdom to unlock its true potential. He used it merely as a weapon, a tool to bend the minds of others to his will. Morwen gazed upon the stone and felt her mind drawn inexorably toward its swirling depth. Within its darkness, she saw stars that burned with colors for which there were no names, and between those stars moved shapes of such alien beauty and terror that her sanity reeled at their sight. "What are they?" she whispered. "The firstborn," Arian replied. "Not the Eldar, but those who came before them, before light, before darkness, before the music itself. They dwell in the void between the stars, and they have been waiting since time's beginning for the barriers to weaken. And you would let them into our world?" Arian's laugh was like silver bells, but there was no warmth in it. "Let them? Dear mother, I have already begun to summon them. The creatures you met in the Dead Marsh were but the smallest of their servants, sent ahead to prepare the way. Soon, the star spawn will walk openly beneath our sun, and Middle-earth will know masters far greater than ever Melkor dreamed of being." "You are not my daughter," Morwen said, and this time there was no doubt in her voice, only a grief beyond measure. "What have you done with her?" The figure before her smiled, and as she did so, her fair features began to shift and change. The silver hair darkened to black, the pale skin took on a bluish cast, and the eyes became as deep and empty as the spaces between stars. "I am what your daughter became when she gazed too long into the star-stone," said the being. "Her mind, her memories, her love for you, all are woven into my being now. In a sense, I am more truly Arian than she ever was, for I possess not only her experiences, but those of 1,000,000 others who have looked upon forbidden truth." Morwen drew her blade again, but even as she did so, she felt a terrible weakness creeping through her limbs. The very air of the tower seemed to sap her strength and cloud her thoughts. "You cannot harm me here, brave ranger," said the creature wearing her daughter's memories. "This place exists partially outside the stream of time itself. Here, I am as a god among mortals." "Then why bring me here?" Morwen gasped, falling to one knee. "What do you want of me?" "I want you to witness the birth of a new age," the being replied. "Your bloodline is old, Morwen of the Dunedain. It reaches back to Numenor, yes, but further still, to the very roots of the First Age. In your vein runs the blood of those who spoke with the Valar face to face, who walked in the gardens of Valinor ere the sun and moon were made." The creature gestured to the great seeing stone, and within its depths new visions formed. Images of Morwen's ancestors in ages long forgotten, kings and queens of Numenor standing in halls of pearl and gold. "Such blood is precious to my masters," the being continued. "It can serve as a bridge between worlds, a conduit through which the star spawn might enter this reality without tearing it asunder. Give yourself willingly to this purpose, and I will grant you a boon. I will restore your daughter's consciousness, allowing her to exist alongside mine in this form. Refuse, and she will be lost forever in the depths of my being." Morwen closed her eyes and felt the weight of choice pressing down upon her like a mountain. To save her daughter, must she doom all of Middle-earth to the dominion of alien gods? As Morwen knelt in apparent defeat, her fingers found the phial that Faramir had given her, the one filled with water from the fountain of the White Tree. The moment she touched it, strength flowed back into her limbs, and the oppressive atmosphere of the tower seemed to lessen its grip upon her mind. "The White Tree," she whispered, understanding dawning upon her. "It grows from the same soil that holds the roots of Nimloth, which itself was a seedling of Galathilion in Valinor. Its water carries the blessing of the Valar themselves." The creature that wore her daughter's face recoiled slightly. "Clever, mother, but even the power of the Valar has limits in this place." Morwen rose to her feet, the phial held before her like a torch in darkness. "Perhaps, but their power flows through more than water and wood. It flows through the choices of free beings who choose good over evil, hope over despair." She struck out with her Númenórean blade, and where it touched the creature's form, silver fire blazed forth. The being screamed, not with her daughter's voice, but with a sound like the death of stars. "You cannot destroy me," it cried. "I am woven from the very substance of your daughter's soul." "I know," Morwen said, and tears streamed down her cheeks even as she pressed her attack. "But I can choose to save her the only way that remains, by preventing her from becoming the instrument of our world's destruction." The battle that followed was not one of steel and strength, but of will against will, love against corruption. Each blow Morwen struck with her blessed blade carved away another layer of the creature's false form, revealing glimpses of her daughter's true face beneath the alien overlay. "Mother," gasped Ariane's voice, faint but unmistakably her own. "The stone! You must destroy the stone." Even as the creature fought to maintain its hold on Ariane's form, Morwen turned her attention to the great palantir that dominated the chamber. Its surface pulsed with malevolent light, and through its crystalline depths she could see vast shapes beginning to stir in the spaces between worlds. "You cannot!" shrieked the being. "If you destroy the Star Stone, the backlash will kill us all." "Then we die well," Morwen replied, raising her blade above the Seeing Stone's surface. "Better death with honor than life as slaves to cosmic horror." Ursa. But even as she prepared to strike, the tower began to shake with tremendous force. Through the crystal walls, she could see the landscape of Mordor itself changing, the very foundations of the earth cracking and heaving as something vast stirred beneath them. "It is too late," laughed the creature, though its voice was weakening as Ariane's spirit fought for control of their shared form. "The first of the star spawn wakes. Azathoth the blind rises from the depths, where it has slumbered since the world's making." From the eastern reaches of Mordor came a sound that was not quite music and not quite screaming, a cacophony that spoke of geometries that human minds were never meant to comprehend. The black peaks of the Ash Mountains began to crumble, revealing beneath them structures of non-Euclidean stone that hurt the eye to look upon. "The Void Caller," whispered Ariane's fading voice. "It built its city here when the world was young, then slept and the music of creation drowned out its own anti-song. But now it wakes to remake all things in its own image." Morwen felt despair crash over her like a black tide. How could mortal strength stand against a being that had existed since before the foundations of the world were laid? Yet even as hopelessness threatened to consume her, she remembered the words of an old song her own mother had taught her. "A light from the shadows shall spring, renewed shall be blade that was broken, the crownless again shall be king." If hope could triumph over the Lord of Darkness himself, perhaps it could yet prevail against this newer threat. With a cry that echoed her ancestors' war songs from the halls of Numenor, Morwen brought her blade down upon the Star Stone with all her strength. The moment steel met crystal, the world exploded into light and sound. But this was not the chaos she had expected. Instead, she found herself standing not in the crystal tower, but in a vast hall of unimaginable beauty. Pillars of living light stretched up into infinity, and between them walked figures of such glory that she could barely look upon them. "Welcome, daughter of Numenor," said a voice, like the sound of silver trumpets. Before her stood one of the Valar themselves, Manwë, Lord of the West, his eyes reflecting the light of stars uncounted. "My lord," Morwen gasped, falling to her knees, "I have failed. The ancient evil wakes, and I lack the power to stop it." "You have not failed," said another voice, and she looked up to see Varda Elantari, Queen of the Stars herself. "You have done what we could not. You have given us warning of this threat, and weakened its hold upon this reality." "The star spawn are indeed ancient," Manwë explained. "They existed before the music of creation itself, dwelling in the void that surrounded Ea. When Eru Ilúvatar sang the world into being, his song pressed them back into the outer darkness, but it could not destroy them entirely. They have waited long ages for the barriers to weaken, and now they have," Morwen said. "What hope remains?" Varda smiled, and the light of her face outshone 1,000 suns. "The same hope that has always existed, child. The music continues still, and all who dwell within its bounds may add their voices to its harmony. Your daughter's spirit yet fights for freedom. Will you help her sing?" Suddenly, Morwen understood. The creature that held Ariane was not truly invincible. It was merely a discord in the great music, a false note that could be corrected if enough voices sang in opposition to it. "Show me how," she said. When Morwen's awareness returned to the crystal tower, she found the scene much changed. The being that had worn her daughter's face was writhing in apparent agony, its form shifting between Ariane's familiar features and the alien countenance of its true nature. What is happening to me?" it gasped. "You are being corrected," Morwen said, and her voice carried harmonies that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the elder days. "The music of creation flows through me now, and it will not suffer your discord to continue." Around them, the tower began to resonate with new frequency. The crystal walls hummed with power, and through their translucent surfaces, Morwen could see the landscape of Mordor beginning to heal. Green shoots pushed up through the poisoned soil, and clean water began to flow where once only ash and darkness had reigned. But even as the immediate threat began to fade, Morwen knew that the greater danger still remained. Far beneath the earth, the thing called Azathoth stirred in its ancient city, and its awakening would mean the end of all ordered existence. "The Star Stone," whispered Ariane's voice, growing stronger as the alien presence weakened. "Mother, you must use it, not to summon the Void Dwellers, but to sing them back to sleep." Morwen approached the great Palantir, no longer afraid of its dark radiance. As she placed her hands upon its surface, she felt the full weight of cosmic history pressing down upon her. The birth and death of stars, the rise and fall of civilizations, the eternal struggle between order and chaos. "I cannot do this alone," she said. "You are not alone," came a chorus of voices. Through the crystal walls of the tower, she could see them coming, figures of light that she recognized as the spirits of all who had ever stood against darkness, kings and heroes of ages past, simple folk who had chosen courage over fear, and yes, even hobbits, whose small voices had once helped save the world. At their head walked two figures she knew well, Aragorn and Gandalf, their forms shining with the light of the undying lands. "The living and the dead unite," said Gandalf, his voice carrying across the years. "All who have loved this world will lend their strength to yours." The song that arose from the Tower of the Inverted Moon was unlike any music that had been heard since the world's beginning. It was not the triumphant march of victory over evil, but something deeper and more primal, the lullaby that existence itself might sing to quiet the nightmares that dwelt in the spaces between dreams. Through the great Palantir, Morwen could see into the very depths of the earth, where the city of Azathoth lay revealed in all its non-Euclidean horror. The blind god writhed in its sleep, cosmic tentacles lashing out to reshape reality according to its alien will. But as the song grew stronger, its movements began to slow. "It is not enough," gasped the creature that held Ariane's form. "The Void Caller is too ancient, too powerful. Your mortal song cannot overcome the chaos music it has sung since before time began." But even as it spoke, new voices joined the chorus. From the Tower of Ecthelion in Minas Tirith came the sound of horns and trumpets. From Lothlorien, the Galadrim sang with voices like silver bells. From the Grey Havens, the ships of the Eldar added their farewell songs to the growing symphony. And from the Shire, blessed, simple Shire, came the voices of hobbits singing songs of growing things and comfortable homes, of seed time and harvest, of all the small joys that made life worth preserving. "The music of creation," Morwen whispered, understanding at last. "It never ended. It has been singing all along in every act of love, every choice for good, every refusal to surrender hope." The Palantir blazed with light that was not of this world, and through its crystal depths, the song reached into the most distant corners of existence. In the void between stars, ancient horrors felt the pull of eternal sleep. On distant worlds, Tyrants found their will to cruelty mysteriously fading, and in the depths beneath Mordor, Azathoth the Blind slowly closed its cosmic eyes and sank back into the slumber that had held it since the world's dawn. The creature that had held Arianne screamed once more, and then its alien features melted away like ice in spring water. What remained was Morwen's daughter, older than when she had left, marked by her ordeal, but unmistakably herself. "Mother," Arianne whispered, falling into Morwen's embrace. "I'm sorry. I saw such wonders and terrors in that cursed stone, and I thought I could master them." "The important thing," Morwen said, stroking her daughter's hair, "is that you remembered who you were when it mattered most." In the days that followed, the transformation of Mordor was nothing short of miraculous. Where once the land had been a wasteland of ash and poison, now green fields stretched to the horizon. The ash mountains crumbled away entirely, revealing beneath them hills clothed in forests that seemed to remember the elder days. King Elisar came himself to witness the wonder, bringing with him a great company of the wise and learned. Faramir rode beside him, his face bright with amazement at the healing of the land he had long guarded. "It is as if Middle-earth itself has been renewed," he said to Morwen as they stood together on what had once been the plateau of Gorgoroth. "The very air tastes sweeter here than in lands that were never touched by shadow." Morwen nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "The danger is not ended," she said, "merely postponed. The star spawn still dwell in the void, and there will always be those who seek to wake what should remain sleeping. Then we must remain vigilant," said King Elisar. "But for now, let us celebrate this victory. A new chapter in the history of Middle-earth begins today." The Tower of the Inverted Moon had vanished with the breaking of the Starstone, leaving behind only a hill crowned with a spring of pure water. But in the depths of that spring, if one looked carefully at just the right angle, one could still see stars reflected. Not the stars of night, but the stars of the music itself, singing their eternal song of hope and renewal. Arianne had chosen to remain in the healed land, helping to guide the settlers who came to build new homes in what was now being called the Garden of Memory. She bore the title of Keeper of the Spring, charged with watching for any signs that the ancient evils might stir again. "Will you stay with me, Mother?" she asked, as they stood together beside the spring on the first anniversary of the great healing. Morwen smiled and shook her head. "My road lies elsewhere, daughter. The rangers are needed now more than ever, to watch and ward against dangers that most folk cannot imagine. But I will come to you whenever you call." As the sun set over the transformed landscape, mother and daughter stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the whisper of wind through leaves that had grown from soil once thought forever barren. In that whisper, those with ears to hear could detect the faint echo of the music that had saved the world, not through sword or sorcery, but through the simple power of love refusing to surrender to despair. And in the depths of the spring, the stars sang on, their light a promise that no darkness, however ancient or terrible, could ever truly extinguish the hope that burned in the hearts of free beings who chose to stand together against the night. Thus ended the tale of she who walked into Mordor, though the songs say her story was but one note in a symphony that will continue as long as Middle-earth endures. For the music of creation plays on, and all who dwell within its bounds may add their voices to its endless, joyful refrain. Here ends the chronicle of the Starstone, as set down by the scribes of Minas Tirith in the Fourth Age of Middle-earth, when the Black Land bloomed again and hope returned to places long forsaken. Epilogue. The Garden, Eternal Being, an account of the years that followed the healing of the Black Land, as recorded by the chroniclers of the Fourth Age. The spring of memory 7 years had passed since the great music had silenced the Void-caller's song, and the land that men now called Mordor renewed bore little resemblance to the wasteland of legend. Where once Mount Doom had belched forth fire and ash, now stood the Hill of Seven Springs, its slopes carpeted with flowers that bloomed in colors for which the common tongue had no name. The largest of these springs was that which Ariane tended, its waters clear as crystal and sweet, beyond compare. Yet those who dwelt in the garden of memory knew that their paradise had been bought with a price beyond reckoning, and that vigilance was the eternal cost of peace. For in the deepest hours of night, when the moon was dark and the wind carried strange whispers from the eastern waste, those with the sight could still perceive shadows moving in the spaces between worlds, patient, ancient, and eternally hungry. Ariane had grown wise in her years as keeper of the spring. Her hair, once golden as wheat in summer, now bore streaks of silver that caught the starlight like threads of mithril. The ordeal of her possession by the star spawn had marked her in ways that went deeper than flesh, granting her perceptions that few mortals could bear. She could see the patterns that connected all things, the invisible threads of fate and choice that wove through the music of creation like silver wire through a tapestry. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of fire and gold, she stood beside her spring watching ripples spread across its surface. Each ripple carried within it the memory of a choice made, a life lived, a song sung in defiance of the dark. She had learned to read these patterns as others might read the pages of a book, finding in them the stories of all who had touched the renewed land with their presence. "The stars are restless tonight," came a familiar voice behind her. Ariane turned to see her mother approaching, travel-worn and weathered as always, but with eyes that still burned bright with purpose. "Mother," Ariane said, embracing the older woman warmly, "you arrive at a time of portents. The spring has been showing me visions all day, glimpses of what was, what is, and what yet might be." Morwen studied her daughter's face, noting the lines of care that had not been there 7 years past. "What manner of vision?" "Ships," Ariane replied, her gaze turning eastward toward the distant shores of Nurn. "Great ships sailing from harbors that exist in no maps we know, bearing cargo that should not exist in the waking world, and riders, not of flesh and blood, but of shadow and starlight, carrying messages between powers that dwell beyond the circles of the world." The two women walked together along the spring's edge, their footsteps silent on moss that glowed faintly with its own inner light. This was one of the wonders of the renewed land, that life here seemed touched by something beyond the merely natural, as if the very soil remembered the music that had healed it and sought to echo that harmony in all things that grew. "I have seen signs myself," Morwen said at length. "In Ithilien, the Malorn trees whisper of ships that sail the river of stars. In Rohan, the horses grow restless beneath night skies, as if they scent wolves that run on winds from other worlds. And from the Grey Havens comes word that the Eldar have begun preparing new ships, not for the journey west to Valinor, but for voyages to shores that exist only in the space between sleeping and waking." Ariane nodded grimly. "The barriers weaken again, not as they did when the star stone was whole, but slowly, subtly, like a dam developing hairline cracks that will one day become a flood." They came to a halt at the spring's heart, where the water bubbled up from depths that seemed to extend far beyond the merely physical. Here, in the dancing interplay of water and starlight, the most profound visions could be glimpsed by those with the courage to look deeply enough. "Show me," Morwen said simply. Together, mother and daughter knelt beside the water and gazed into its depths. At first, they saw only their own reflections, two women marked by trials and sorrows, yet unbowed by the weight of the darkness they had faced. But as their breathing steadied and their minds grew still, other images began to form in the water's mirror. They saw the halls of Minas Tirith, where King Elisar sat in council with lords and scholars, their faces grave as they studied reports from the furthest corners of his realm. Strange lights in the sky above Forochel, where the northern waste met the grinding ice. Merchants in Dale speaking fearfully of goods that arrived in their markets bearing no maker's mark, crafted from materials that existed in no earthly mine. The visions shifted, showing them glimpses of lands beyond Middle-earth's borders. In the far south, beyond even the realm of Harad, cities of black glass rose from desert sand, their spires reaching toward stars that burned with colors unknown to earthly astronomy. Their inhabitants moved with the fluid grace of those who had never known mortality, and their eyes held depths that reflected eons of alien thought. "The forgotten colonies," Ariane whispered, recognizing them from her time within the Starstone's influence. "The cities that the Starspawn built in the dawn times, before the music drove them into the deep places of the earth. They stir again, though their builders sleep on." The water's surface rippled, and new scenes appeared. Ships, indeed, great vessels that seemed built from congealed shadow and starlight, their sails catching winds that blew from directions that existed only in dreams. These ships carried no human crew, but beings of such alien beauty and terror that the mind recoiled from attempting to categorize them. "They come not as conquerors," Morwen observed, her voice tight with unease, "but as merchants, diplomats." "Worse," Ariane replied. "They come as teachers, bearing gifts of knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. In ages past, such gifts were given to the smiths of Austin Edhil, and from that teaching came the rings of power. What greater horrors might spring from wisdom shared by beings who remember the time before time?" The visions in the spring grew more urgent now, showing them flashes of possible futures spreading out like branches on a cosmic tree. In some, Middle-earth stood transformed into something unrecognizable, a realm where the very laws of nature bent to alien will, where mortals lived as pampered pets to masters whose true forms their minds could not encompass. In others, great wars raged between those who would preserve the music of creation and those who sought to replace it with harmonies drawn from the spaces between stars. But in a few, precious few, they glimpsed something else. Communities of the wise and watchful, working together to maintain the barriers between worlds, keeping alive the songs that held the ancient evils at bay. And at the heart of these communities stood figures they recognized. Ariane herself, grown old but undaunted, teaching new generations of keepers to tend the springs of memory. Morwen, her hair white as snow, but her spirit unbroken, leading companies of rangers who patrolled boundaries that existed more in thought than in geography. "So," Ariane said, as the visions faded, "we have our answer. The choice before us is not whether to act, but how." Morwen rose from beside the spring, her hand instinctively checking the blessed blade at her side. "The king must be warned, and word sent to all the free peoples, that they might prepare for trials greater than any they have yet faced. Preparation alone will not suffice," Ariane said, her voice carrying a note of authority that had not been there in her youth. "We must gather those with the sight, those who can perceive the true nature of what approaches. A new fellowship must be formed, not to destroy a ring, but to preserve the very foundations of reality itself." As if in response to her words, the spring began to glow with a soft, pearlescent light. From its depths rose shapes that were not quite solid, not quite spirit, the forms of those who had passed beyond the circles of the world, but whose love for Middle-earth had bound them to its fate. Gandalf the White stood before them, his form translucent, but his eyes as keen as ever. Beside him were the shapes of kings and heroes, lords and ladies, and simple folk whose courage had once turned the tide of darkness. Even Frodo was there, his face peaceful, but his gaze alert, as if he had been waiting long ages for this moment. "The time of the second music approaches," Gandalf said, his voice carrying across the years like an echo of distant thunder. "When the songs of creation and uncreation meet in final harmony, and all things find their true names at last." "How long do we have?" Morwen asked. "Time moves strangely now," replied the shade of King Elisar, his crown gleaming with spectral light. "The barriers between what is and what might be grow thin, and years may pass as days, or moments stretch into centuries. But the signs you have seen are true. The deep singers wake, and they remember their ancient hunger." Ariane stepped forward, her face set with determination. "Then we must wake the guardians as well. Every spring, every well, every place where the music touched earth during the great healing, they must be awakened and warded." If the enemy would corrupt the very foundations of existence, then we must make those foundations strong beyond their power to break. The ghostly assembly nodded as one, and Frodo's shade spoke with a voice like wind through growing wheat. As once we bore a ring to its unmaking, now you must bear songs to their awakening. The burden will be no lighter, and the road no shorter, but the courage that served in that dark hour will serve again in the trials to come. One by one, the shades began to fade, but their final words lingered in the air, like a benediction. Remember that no evil, however ancient, can triumph over love freely given. The music plays on, and all who choose to join their voices to its harmony become part of something greater than themselves. When the last echo of their voices had died away, mother and daughter stood alone beside the spring once more. But the water's surface now showed them not visions of possible futures, but reflections of the star-filled sky above, stars that sang with voices they could almost, but not quite, understand. "Where do we begin?" Morwen asked. Ariane smiled, and in that smile was something of the child she had been, and something of the ancient wisdom she had gained through suffering. "Where all great journeys begin, with a single step, and the faith that others will follow." The gathering of the wise. Within a month of that fateful night by the spring, riders had gone forth from the Garden of Memory to every corner of Middle-earth. They bore no visible tokens of authority, carried no royal seals or documents of state. Yet everywhere they went, they found themselves expected. For the wise and the far-seeing had felt the stirring in their bones, had tasted the change in the very air they breathed. To Minas Tirith rode Ariane herself, traveling for the first time in 7 years beyond the borders of her sanctuary. The city seemed smaller than she remembered, its white walls less blindingly bright, as if her expanded perceptions had diminished her capacity for simple wonder. Yet when she walked the court of the fountain and saw the white tree blooming in defiance of the season, she felt her heart lift with something approaching joy. King Elisar received her in private audience, his face grave with the weight of the reports that had been reaching him from across his realm. Age had silvered his beard and lined his face, but his eyes remained clear and sharp, missing nothing of the change that suffering had wrought in the young woman he had once blessed for a desperate mission. "Lady Ariane," he said, rising from the throne of Gondor to greet her as an equal, "your message spoke of great peril, but gave few details. Speak freely now. What shadow rises to threaten the peace we have so dearly won?" She told him all, of the visions in the spring, of the ships that sailed impossible seas, of the colonies of the star spawn stirring to alien life in distant deserts. She spoke of the barriers between worlds growing thin, of knowledge being offered that would corrupt the very foundations of thought, of powers that remembered the time before the music, and sought to sing their own discordant songs over the harmony of creation. When she had finished, Elisar sat in silence for long moments, his hands steepled before his face. Finally, he spoke. "In my youth, I might have called such tales the product of an overactive imagination, but I have learned to trust the wisdom of those who have looked into the abyss and returned to tell of it. What would you have me do?" "Summon a great council," Ariane replied without hesitation, "not merely of the lords of Gondor and Rohan, but of all who possess knowledge of the deeper mysteries. Send word to Lothlorien, though it be reduced to naught but memory. Call upon the sons of Elrond, if they yet linger in the halls of their father. Seek out the wise among the dwarves, and the far-seeing among the hobbits. For this threat cannot be met by sword and shield alone. It must be countered with wisdom and song, with knowledge of the true names of things." And so it was done. Ravens flew from Minas Tirith to every corner of the known world, bearing messages written in scripts both ancient and modern. Some were addressed to rulers and lords, others to hermits and scholars whose very names were known to few. The summons was simple: come to the citadel of the stars on the first new moon of spring, for the fate of all free peoples hung in the balance. They came from lands near and far, Gimli, the dwarf, now lord of the glittering caves, arrived with a company of his kinsmen, who bore tools of strange design, implements capable of working not merely stone and metal, but the very substance of space and time. From the Shire came Samwise Gamgee, no longer the simple gardener who had once carried his master toward Mount Doom, but mayor of the Shire and keeper of its deepest lore. More surprising were those who came unbidden. An Entwife materialized from the gardens of Ithilien, her bark-like skin bearing flowers that bloomed with their own inner light. She gave her name as Fimbrathil, and claimed to have been sleeping in the deep places of the earth, until the stirring of ancient powers had wakened her from her long dream. From the Grey Havens came Círdan the shipwright, his eyes holding depths that reflected all the sorrows of the elder days. With him traveled a small company of elves whose faces bore expressions of such profound sadness that mortals wept merely to look upon them. For these were they who had chosen to remain in Middle-earth past the ending of their time, binding themselves to its fate with chains of love and duty that could not be broken. But perhaps most unexpected of all were the two figures who arrived on the council's final day, a man and woman of middle years, dressed in the simple garb of merchants, yet bearing themselves with the dignity of king. They gave their names as Beren and Luthien, and though they bore human seeming, those with the sight could perceive the light of Valinor that clung to them like a cloak of stars. "We heard the call," Luthien said simply when questioned about their presence. "Though our road leads always westward toward the undying lands, we are permitted to turn aside when the fate of the music itself hangs in doubt." The great council convened in the Hall of Kings, beneath banners that had flown in battles whose names had passed into legend. But this gathering bore little resemblance to the martial councils of ages past. Here were no strategies of war discussed, no deployments of armies planned. Instead, voices rose and fell in harmony as the assembled wise ones shared knowledge that had been hoarded like precious gems in the treasure houses of memory. Círdan spoke of the straight road that led from Middle-earth to Valinor, and how of late that path had grown twisted and uncertain, as if something in the void through which it passed had shifted position. The Entwife Fimbrathil sang in a voice like wind through ancient forests of the deep roots that connected all living things, and how those roots now carried whispers in tongues that had been spoken before the first tree took leaf. Gimli's kinsmen displayed tools of their own making, hammers that could shape thoughts as easily as they shaped steel, chisels that carved meaning directly into the substance of reality. "We delved too deep," the old dwarf admitted with characteristic bluntness, "and found chambers that our fathers never made, filled with machinery that worked according to principles we do not understand. But we learn, slowly, and perhaps in time, we will comprehend enough to be of service." Sam Gamgee, his face weathered by years, but his eyes still bright with the wonder that had carried him through the darkest places of the world, spoke of changes in the Shire that few had noticed. Plants growing in patterns that seemed to spell out messages in scripts no hobbit could read. Animals gathering in formations that traced symbols of power upon the green hills. "It's as if the very earth is trying to remember something," he said in his simple, direct way. "Like when you've got a word on the tip of your tongue, but can't quite bring it to mind. Only this word, whatever it is so big and important that all of creation is holding its breath, waiting to remember it." Fee! But it was Beren who brought the most unsettling news. In the halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the dead await their appointed times, there is great unrest. Souls that should have departed for their final rest cling to the boundaries of existence, as if they sense that something fundamental is about to change. The Valar themselves are troubled, for they perceive in the void movements of powers they had thought forever banished. "Yet this may be to our advantage," Luthien added, her voice carrying harmonies that made the very stones of the hall ring in sympathy. "For if the ancient evils stir, so too do the ancient goods. The music of creation itself grows stronger in response to the threat, and all who align themselves with its purpose will find their power magnified beyond what they could achieve alone." As the council progressed, a plan began to take shape. Not a plan of battle, but something far more subtle and complex. They would establish a network of watchers and guardians, centered on places where the music had touched the earth with particular force. Each guardian would tend a sacred site, a spring, a grove, a stone circle, keeping alive the songs that held reality stable, and watching for signs of incursion from realms that should remain forever separate. Ariane would return to her spring in the Garden of Memory, but she would not work alone. Others would join her there, scholars and singers, seers and servants of the secret fire. Together, they would weave a web of protection that stretched across all the known lands, each thread a song, each knot a choice, to stand firm against the encroaching dark. And if this proves insufficient, asked King Elisar, if the deep singers find ways to breach our defenses? It was Gandalf's voice that answered, though he was no longer present in bodily form. His words seemed to come from the very air itself, carried on harmonics that resonated in the deepest chambers of every heart. Then we shall meet them with the second music, the song that all creation has been learning to sing since the world began. For the first music brought forth existence from the void, but the second music will determine what form that existence shall ultimately take. This is the song that was prophesied in the deepest lore, the final harmony that will either confirm creation in its beauty or transform it into something so alien that no trace of what we have loved will remain. A great silence fell over the assembly as the weight of this revelation settled upon them. They had thought themselves facing merely another war between good and evil, but now they understood that they stood at the threshold of something far more fundamental, the final movement in a symphony that had been playing since time began. The singers in the deep one year passed, and then another, and slowly the network of watchers took shape across Middle-earth. In hidden valleys and forgotten ruins, in groves where the trees remembered the elder days, and beside wells that had never run dry, the guardians took up their post and began their vigil. Not all who answered the call were wise in the ways of ancient lore. Some were simple folk, farmers whose fields had yielded crops of unusual virtue, children whose dreams carried echoes of songs they had never learned, craftsmen whose hands shaped beauty without conscious thought. For it had become clear that the power to preserve the music did not depend solely on learning or noble birth, but on something deeper, a harmony between the singer's heart and the fundamental patterns that underlay existence. Morwen had not settled at any single site, but instead traveled ceaselessly between the various outposts, carrying messages and sharing knowledge, ensuring that the network remained strong and the communication swift. In her 70th year, she moved with the same tireless energy that had driven her as a young ranger, sustained by purpose and the knowledge that every day's delay might mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. On this particular autumn morning, she stood upon a hill in what had once been the east fold of Rohan, gazing down at a site that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. Where once there had been only grassland, now rose a structure that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. A tower built not of stone or wood, but of crystallized music, its walls humming with harmonies that existed as much in the realm of thought as in the physical world. This was one of the listening posts, a new type of construction that the dwarf smiths had learned to build using techniques gleaned from their excavations in Khazad-dûm. Each post served as both sanctuary and early warning system, its crystalline walls capable of detecting disturbances in the music from hundreds of miles away. The guardian of this particular post was a young woman named Roswyn, formerly a simple shepherd's daughter from the Westfold, who had demonstrated an uncanny ability to hear the songs that flowed beneath the surface of everyday existence. She met Morwen at the tower's entrance, her face bright with excitement. "Lady Morwen," she called out, "I've heard the most extraordinary thing. For 3 nights running, just before dawn, I've detected what I can only describe as an echo, as if somewhere far away, someone is singing our own songs back to us, but with subtle changes that alter their meaning." Morwen felt a chill run down her spine. Changes of what nature? They take our songs of growth and make them songs of transformation. Our melodies of rest become rhythms of awakening, our harmonies of peace. Roswin paused, struggling to put her perception into words. They become something that might be peace, but peace for being so different from us that sharing it would mean ceasing to be what we are. Together, they climbed to the tower's apex, where a great lens of living crystal provided a view not only of the surrounding countryside, but of the deeper currents that flowed through the fabric of reality. Through this lens, Morwen could perceive the network of guardians spread across Middle-earth, points of light connected by flowing streams of song, forming a vast mandala of protection. But she could also see the shadow that pressed against that mandala from directions that had no name. The deep singers had indeed awakened, and they were testing the barriers, learning the patterns of defense, slowly adapting their own anti-melodies to counter the Guardians' effort. "Show me where you heard these echoes most clearly," Morwen said. Roswin adjusted the crystal lens, turning it toward the northeast. Through its faceted surface, they could perceive the ruins of what had once been Dol Guldur, Sauron's fortress in Mirkwood. But the lens revealed that the ruins were not as empty as they appeared to mortal eyes. Something moved in their depths, not the crude malevolence of orcs, or the blazing hatred that had once emanated from the Dark Tower, but something far more subtle, and therefore more dangerous. The stones themselves seemed to be singing, their ancient malice slowly transforming into something that might almost be called beauty. If one could imagine beauty designed for minds that had never known hope or love, or any of the emotions that made existence precious to mortal hearts. They're not trying to destroy our defenses, Morwen realized with growing alarm. They're trying to corrupt them, to turn our own songs against us by making them serve purposes we never intended. Even as she spoke, the lens showed them new images, glimpses of other guardian posts across Middle-earth, where similar transformations were beginning to take root. A sacred grove in Fangorn, where the trees had begun to sing lullabies that induced not rest, but a deeper sleep, from which the sleeper might emerge, changed beyond recognition. A well in the Shire, whose waters, while still sweet to taste, now carried visions of a green and pleasant land where hobbits lived in perfect contentment, asking no questions and dreaming no dreams that had not been provided for them. "We must warn the others," Roswin said, but even as she reached for the sending stone that would carry her message across the network, the crystal lens showed them something that made both women freeze in terror. Ships, great vessels sailing not upon any earthly sea, but through the void between stars. Their hulls wrought from substances that existed only in dreams and nightmares. They moved in formation toward Middle-earth, and in their wake followed creatures of such alien majesty that the mind recoiled from attempting to comprehend their form. But it was not the sight of these approaching horrors that struck despair into Morwen's heart. It was the realization that some of the ships bore passengers she recognized, figures that had once been human, transformed by contact with the deep singers into something that retained the appearance of mortality while serving purposes utterly antithetical to human well-being. Among them, she glimpsed faces from her own past, rangers who had disappeared on patrol, merchants who had vanished while trading in distant lands, scholars who had delved too deeply into forbidden lore. All had been changed, adapted, made into perfect ambassadors for a form of existence that promised fulfillment and transcendence while delivering only a hollow mimicry of life. "How long do we have?" Roswin whispered. Morwen studied the movement of the starships, calculating their approach based on her long experience of reading celestial signs. "Days, perhaps hours. They do not travel through normal space, but along paths that exist only in relation to the songs they sing. As our network grows stronger, it makes those paths easier to follow." The terrible irony was not lost on either of them. In building their defenses, they had inadvertently created a beacon that guided their enemies directly to their target. The very songs meant to preserve Middle-earth were being used to ensure its conquest. "There must be something we can do," Roswin said, but her voice carried the hollowness of despair. "There is," Morwen replied, and her tone held a note of grim determination. "But it will require a sacrifice beyond anything we have yet contemplated." She turned from the crystal lens and began to descend the tower's spiraling stairs, moving with the purposeful stride of one who had finally seen clearly what must be done. Roswin hurried after her, demanding explanations, but Morwen's attention was already focused elsewhere, on the network of songs that connected all the Guardian posts, and on the single, desperate gambit that might yet preserve the world they loved. "If we cannot prevent them from using our songs as guides," she said, as they reached the tower's base, "then we must change the songs themselves, not gradually, not with the slow care we have taken thus far, but all at once, in a great chord that will either save us or destroy us in the attempt." "The second music," Roswin breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Yes, but not at some distant time when we are fully prepared, as we had hoped. Now, while we still have the power to shape its beginning. For if we wait for the deep singers to arrive and begin their own version of that final song, it will be too late to do anything but listen as reality itself is remade according to their will." Together, they stepped out of the listening post and into the clear morning air. Around them, the grasslands of Rohan stretched to the horizon, golden in the early light, beautiful in the simple way that had inspired songs for generations uncounted. Soon, if Morwen's desperate plan succeeded, all of this might be transformed into something unrecognizable, but if it failed, there would be nothing left worth preserving anyway. The ranger woman raised her voice in a call that carried across the mile, borne by harmonies that touched every guardian post in the network. It was not a song of words, but of pure meaning, a message that conveyed in its very notes the magnitude of the choice that now lay before them. Throughout Middle-earth, the Watchers heard and understood. In her spring in the Garden of Memory, Ariane lifted her own voice in harmony. In his caves beneath the misty mountain, Gimli began to sing in the deep tones that dwarves had learned from the stones themselves. From the Shire came the clear voices of hobbits, and from Lothlorien the ethereal harmonies of the few elves who still linger in the fading realm. They sang not of victory or defeat, not of hope or despair, but of love. Love for the world they had known. Love for the beauty that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. Love for each other, and for all the small, precious things that made existence meaningful. And in that love, the second music found its beginning, not as a song of power or dominion, but as a lament for everything that was beautiful, precisely because it was temporary and fragile. The starships, approaching through dimensions that existed only in dreams, suddenly found their paths altered. The beacon songs they had been following transformed into something else entirely, not a summons or a challenge, but a farewell. And in that farewell was contained all the stubborn, magnificent defiance of mortal hearts that choose to love what they cannot keep forever. The last alliance of song. As the great chord of the second music spread outward from Middle-earth, its effects rippled across all the realms that touched upon the circles of the world. In the undying lands, the Valar felt the tremor of its beginning and knew that the final movement of creation's symphony had begun. In the halls of Mandos, the spirits of the dead stirred with recognition, remembering fragments of the song they had learned before their first birth into time. But it was in the depths of space itself, in the cold void between the stars, that the music's power was most keenly felt. The starships of the deep singers found their formation scattered, as the very medium through which they traveled began to resonate with frequencies that opposed their fundamental nature. Some vessels were forced back into dimensions where thought and matter remained separate, while others found themselves translated into forms so alien to their original purpose that they could no longer remember why they had begun their journey. Yet the greatest of the deep singers were not so easily turned aside. From the flagship that led their fleet, a vessel constructed from crystallized silence and the dreams of dying stars, came a counter-melody of such pure negation that it threatened to unweave the very fabric of the second music before it could properly begin. The entity that commanded this ship had many names in the dark tongues of the void, but among mortals it was known simply as the Unsinger, the power that had existed before the first note of creation was sounded, and which had spent all the ages since learning to craft melodies that would return existence to the primal silence from which it had emerged. Its voice reached across the gulf of space and time, touching the minds of every guardian in the network with words that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the deepest centers of thought. Why do you struggle, little singers? Your songs are beautiful, but beauty is pain when it is forced to end. I offer you silence, not the silence of death, but the silence of perfect peace, where no note need fear to be followed by discord, where no harmony need worry about resolution. In the void that was before beginning, there is no sorrow, for there is nothing that can be lost. Some of the guardians faltered, their voices catching as the terrible logic of the unsinger's words penetrated their defenses. What was the point of preserving a world that would eventually pass away? Why fight to maintain songs that must inevitably come to an end? In the silence that preceded creation, there had been no suffering, no loss, no bitter partings or broken promises. But even as doubt began to weaken the network, a new voice joined the second music, not from any guardian post or sacred site, but from a humble garden in the Shire, where an old hobbit sat beneath a flowering tree, his weathered hands holding a small book filled with pressed leaves and simple sketches. Samwise Gamgee had never considered himself a keeper of great lore or a guardian of cosmic mystery. He was, by his own accounting, just a gardener who had once helped save the world and then returned to the simpler business of helping things grow. But, as the unsinger's voice whispered its seductive promises of eternal silence, Sam found himself remembering something that had sustained him through the darkest hours of his journey to Mount Doom. "There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo," he had said once, in the shadow of the Dark Tower itself, "and it's worth fighting for." Now, as he felt the weight of cosmic despair pressing down upon all creation, Sam opened his mouth and began to sing, not in the high, formal harmonies that the other guardians had learned, but in the simple, sturdy tones of a working hobbit who had spent his life tending growing things. The world's not over while the grass grows green and flowers bloom where flowers have always been. There's work to do and meals to share and friends who show they truly care. The unsinger speaks of perfect peace, but peace ain't peace if struggles cease. It's in the trying, not the end, that we find out who is our friend. The words were simple, almost childlike compared to the complex harmonies that surrounded them, but they carried a power that the unsinger's cosmic philosophy could not touch. For Sam's song spoke not of eternal truths or universal principles, but of small, immediate reality. The taste of strawberry jam on fresh-baked bread, the satisfaction of seeing a garden flourish under careful tending, the warmth of friendship freely given and gladly received. One by one, the other guardians found their voices again, each adding their own simple testimony to the growing chorus. Roswyn sang of the sheep she had once tended, their gentle bleating at dawn, and the way they trusted her to lead them to safe pasture. Gimli's deep bass rumbled with memories of the ring of hammer on anvil, the satisfaction of shaping raw metal into something both beautiful and useful. From Minas Tirith came the voices of merchants and bakers, soldiers and scribes, each contributing their own small verse to the great song. They sang not of cosmic significance, but of daily joys, the laughter of children playing in the fountains, the pride of work well done, the comfort of coming home after a long journey. The unsinger's response was swift and terrible. If simple pleasures were to be the foundation of this second music, then those pleasures would be shown for the ephemeral illusions they truly were. The great ship turned its attention fully upon Middle-earth, and from its crystalline hull poured forth visions of ending, not the gentle completion of natural cycles, but the harsh revelation of mortality's ultimate futility. Every guardian saw their own death and the deaths of all they loved. They witnessed the inevitable decay of every garden, the crumbling of every building, the forgetting of every song they had ever sung. Children would grow old and die. Seasons would turn until the very stars burned out, and in the end, all their small joys would be less than dust in an empty universe. "See how your treasures turn to ash," the unsinger whispered. "See how your love becomes loss, your hope becomes despair? Why cling to what cannot last? Why choose the pain of temporal beauty over the peace of eternal silence? The assault was devastating. Across the network, voices began to fade as guardians faced the full weight of mortality's burden. Some simply stopped singing and walked away from their posts, their faces bearing the hollow expression of those who had seen too clearly into the heart of their own ultimate insignificance. But Sam's voice never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger as he contemplated the images of loss and ending that filled his mind. For he had learned something during his journey with Frodo that the Singer, for all its cosmic wisdom, could not understand. That beauty did not become less beautiful for being temporary, but more so. Yes, the roses in my garden fade, and autumn takes the leaves I've raked, but each spring brings them back again, through sunshine and through gentle rain. And if someday no spring should come, and all my gardening work is done, still I'll remember, clear and true, the morning when the roses grew. As he sang, Sam felt a presence beside him, not visible to mortal eyes, but unmistakably real. Frodo had come, drawn by the power of the second music, and by love for the friend who had never left his side. With him came others, Merry and Pippin, their voices raised in harmony, Aragorn, singing the ancient songs of his people, Legolas, whose ethereal tones carried all the beauty of the fading world. Even Boromir, redeemed at last from his moment of weakness, adding his voice to the chorus of those who chose love over despair. The living and the dead, Frodo's spirit whispered, his words harmonizing with Sam's simple melody, united at last in the song that was always meant to be sung together. The Unsinger felt the tide of the music turning against it and deployed its final, most devastating weapon. If these mortals insisted on cherishing their temporary existence, then it would show them what eternity truly meant. Not the peaceful silence it had offered, but an eternity of the very experiences they claimed to treasure, stretched out beyond all meaning until love became torment and joy became agony. The visions that flooded the network now were of gardens that never changed, where the same roses bloomed forever, in exactly the same way, until their beauty became a prison. Of friendships that could never deepen or evolve, trapped in endless repetition of the same conversations and the same gestures. Of meals that never satisfied, because hunger could never truly be felt again. Of songs that lost all meaning through infinite repetition. "This is what you choose," the Unsinger declared. "If you will not accept the peace of ending, then accept the horror of never ending. Your beloved temporality will become an eternal cage, your precious mortality stretched out until it becomes the cruelest immortality imaginable." For a moment, the horror of this vision shook even Sam's steadfast heart. To love something forever without change, to experience the same joys endlessly until they became meaningless. Was this truly better than the gentle silence the Unsinger offered? But then he remembered something else from his journey, something that had sustained him through the long walk across Mordor when hope seemed lost, and every step brought only greater despair. He remembered the small acts of kindness that had carried them forward, sharing water when they had little to spare, taking turns carrying their burdens, simply being present for each other in the darkest hours. The song don't have to be the same each time we sing, each time we came together in the morning light to face another day or night. The garden changes, season by season. That's not the curse. That is the reason beauty matters. Love runs deep. It's ours to tend, not ours to keep. As Sam's voice rose in this new verse, something extraordinary happened. The second music began to transform itself, incorporating not just the simple joys of mortal existence, but the very principle of change that the Unsinger sought to pervert. The song became a celebration not of things as they were, but of things as they could become, of growth and learning, of adaptation and renewal, of the endless possibility for surprise and discovery that made each moment precious precisely because it had never existed before and would never exist again. The network of guardians felt this transformation and responded with voices raised in wonder. They sang now not just of what they loved, but of what they hoped to love in days yet to come. Farmers sang of crops not yet planted, craftsmen of skills not yet learned, parents of children not yet born, who would carry their songs forward into futures they could not imagine. Even the spirits of the dead joined this celebration of change and possibility, for they had learned in their passage beyond the circles of the world that existence was not a problem to be solved, but a story to be told. And the best stories were those where the ending could not be predicted from the beginning. The unsinger found itself in a position it had never experienced in all its eons of existence. It was outnumbered, not by the quantity of voices raised against it, but by the infinite variety of those voices. Each guardian sang differently. Each spirit contributed its own unique harmony. And the resulting music was so complex, so full of unexpected variations and delightful surprises that even the unsinger's vast intelligence could not predict what note would come next. For the first time since the beginning of time, the great negator felt something it had never known: curiosity. What would these strange temporary creatures do next? How would their song develop? What new variations would they discover in the endless fugue of existence? And in that moment of curiosity, the unsinger made a choice that surprised everyone, including itself. Instead of continuing to fight against the second music, it began to listen to, not to find weaknesses to exploit or patterns to corrupt, but simply to hear what it had to say. The silence that had existed before creation was indeed peaceful, the unsinger realized, but it was also boring, endless, unchanging, utterly predictable. But this music, this chaotic symphony of temporary voices singing about temporary things, was something else entirely. It was interesting. Perhaps, thought the unsinger, there is something to be learned from these small singers after all. The harmony of ending and beginning. What followed was the strangest negotiation in the history of creation. The unsinger, its vast intellect turning for the first time toward curiosity rather than negation, began to experiment with harmonies that supported rather than destroyed the second music, not abandoning its nature entirely, for that would have been impossible, but finding ways to contribute endings that made new beginnings possible, silences that made the next note more precious, rests that gave rhythm and meaning to the melody. The starships that had been approaching Middle-earth found their purpose transformed. No longer vessels of conquest, they became something unprecedented, ships of cultural exchange between realms that had never before attempted communication. The beings aboard them were indeed alien beyond human comprehension, but they came now as guests rather than invaders, curious to learn about the strange music these mortals had created. The first embassy arrived on a spring morning in the Garden of Memory, descending from the sky in a vessel that looked like a soap bubble filled with starlight. From it emerged creatures that appeared to be made of living mathematics, geometric forms that shifted and flowed according to principles that had no names in any earthly language. Ariane met them beside her spring, no longer afraid but filled with the wonder of a naturalist encountering a previously unknown species. Through means that bypassed language entirely, the mathematical beings conveyed their amazement at the concept of growth, the idea that something could change over time while maintaining its essential identity. In their realm, all forms were perfect and eternal, but also static. They had achieved the ultimate goal their philosophy demanded, but in doing so, had lost something whose absence they had never noticed until they heard the songs of Middle-earth. They wanted to learn about change, about the beauty that came from imperfection, slowly becoming more perfect, about the joy of tending something and watching it flourish. We offer exchange. Their communication pulsed through Ariane's mind in concepts rather than words. We teach preservation, how to make moments last longer without losing their meaning. You teach us cultivation, how to make things grow in ways that increase rather than diminish beauty. Similar exchanges were taking place at guardian posts throughout Middle-earth. The dwarf smiths found themselves in dialogue with crystalline entities that existed as pure form, learning from each other about the relationship between structure and purpose. The elves of Lothlorien welcomed visitors who experienced time as a symphony rather than a linear progression, sharing songs about memory and the bittersweet beauty of things that fade. Even in the Shire, where the very concept of alien contact might have been expected to cause panic, the hobbits received their strange guests with characteristic equanimity. The beings who came to them were like living gardens, entities that existed as ecosystems of thought and emotion, fascinated by the hobbit approach to cultivation that involved both careful planning and willingness to let things grow in their own way. They want to learn about randomness, Sam explained to a gathering of his fellow hobbits, as they watched their visitors attempt to understand the concept of a weed, something that grew where it wasn't planned, but might turn out to be beautiful anyway. Seems in their world, everything grows according to perfect patterns. They can't figure out how our gardens can be so pretty when half the plants just show up on their own. But perhaps the most significant exchange was the one that took place between the Unsinger itself and the collective consciousness of all who had contributed to the second music. This dialogue occurred not in any physical location, but in the spaces between notes, the pauses between breaths that gave rhythm and meaning to the great song. I begin to understand. The Unsinger communicated through harmonies that resonated in every guardian's mind. Why you choose the pain of temporality. It is not despite the ending that your experiences have meaning, but because of it. Each moment becomes precious precisely because it cannot be repeated. That's part of it, came the collective response. A harmony of voices from across Middle-earth and beyond. But there's something else too. The meaning isn't just in the individual moments, but in how they connect to each other. The story we tell together by living our separate lives in harmony. The Unsinger pondered this for a time that might have been seconds or centuries. In the spaces between notes, duration became meaningless. Show me, it finally requested. Show me this story you speak of. What followed was a revelation that transformed not only the Unsinger, but the very nature of the second music itself. The voices of the Guardians began to weave together a narrative that encompassed all the ages of Middle-earth, from the music of creation that brought the world into being, through all the long years of growth and struggle, to this moment of potential transformation. But it was not a story told in words or images. Instead, it was sung in pure meaning, each voice contributing its own thread to a tapestry that showed how individual choices shaped collective destiny, how small acts of kindness rippled outward to influence the fate of nations, how love freely given created connections that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The Unsinger experienced, for the first time, the joy of narrative surprise, the moment when disparate plot threads suddenly came together in ways that were both unexpected and inevitable. It felt the satisfaction of witnessing character growth, the bittersweet pleasure of seeing beloved figures pass away, knowing that their influence would continue through those they had touched. This story, the Unsinger realized, it has no ending. Exactly, the voices replied. That's what makes it beautiful. There will always be new chapters, new voices joining the song, new variations on the eternal theme. Even when our individual parts end, the music continues, and you do not fear that it might someday become discordant? Of course we do, Sam's voice responded, cutting through the cosmic harmonies with its simple honesty. That's what makes choosing harmony so meaningful. If we couldn't choose discord, then choosing harmony wouldn't matter much, would it? The Unsinger was quiet for a long moment, a pause that the Guardians had learned to recognize as the sound of a vast intelligence restructuring its understanding of fundamental reality. When it spoke again, its voice carried tones that none of them had heard before, wonder, and something that might almost have been humility. I wish to learn this art of storytelling, it said, but I fear that my nature makes me suited only for ending. How can one whose essence is negation contribute to a tale of growth and connection? It was Morwen who answered, her voice carrying all the authority of one who had walked through shadow and emerged into light. Every good story needs ending. Not the ending that destroys everything that came before, but the ending that completes the pattern, that shows how all the struggles and sorrows and joys were leading to something beautiful. We need you to help us sing the endings that make the beginnings possible. And so, the unsinger became the first of the deep singers to join the second music, not as an opponent, but as a collaborator. Its vast understanding of entropy and conclusion was tempered by the guardian's knowledge of renewal and continuation, creating harmonies that spoke of cycles within cycles, of death that was not destruction but transformation. The starships that had once carried armies of conquest now became vessels of a different kind of colonization. Not the conquest of space, but the cultivation of understanding between forms of existence so different that they might have remained forever incomprehensible to each other. The new age dawns. 7 more years passed, and Middle-earth had become something that would have been unrecognizable to those who had known it in earlier ages, yet somehow more itself than it had ever been. The boundaries between the mortal world and the realms beyond had not disappeared, but had become more like the borders between countries, permeable to those with proper understanding, but still maintaining the distinct character of each region. In the Garden of Memory, Ariane tended not only her original spring, but a grove of what the visitors called possibility trees, living entities that grew not just in space, but in time, their branches extending into potential futures, their roots drawing nourishment from alternate pasts. She had aged gracefully into her role as the first ambassador of deep exchange, facilitating communication between beings whose thought processes were so alien that translation required not just linguistic skill, but fundamental empathy. Her mother Morwen had finally accepted a stationary post, becoming the keeper of the Archive of Song, a vast collection that contained not just the melodies sung by the guardians of Middle-earth, but harmonies contributed by beings from across the known realms. Some of these songs could only be perceived by creatures with crystalline nervous systems. Others existed purely as mathematical relationships, and a few could only be experienced by those willing to temporarily surrender their fixed sense of self. The network of guardian posts had evolved into something resembling a vast musical instrument, its individual nodes capable of producing harmonies of incredible complexity. But the music they made was no longer defensive in nature. Instead, it had become exploratory, a constant song of discovery that reached out into the unknown, always ready to welcome new voices while maintaining the core themes that defined the essential character of Middle-earth. King Elisar, now in his 80s but still sharp of mind and strong of will, had established the Council of Worlds, a governing body that included not only representatives of the free peoples of Middle-earth, but ambassadors from realms that existed in dimensions adjacent to normal space-time. The challenges of diplomacy with beings whose life cycles spanned geological ages or whose concept of individual identity was fundamentally collective, had required the development of entirely new forms of government and law. Yet perhaps the most remarkable change was in the simplest aspects of daily life. In hobbit holes throughout the Shire, children grew up learning songs that had been taught to them by entities of living light. Dwarf smiths crafted tools that could shape not just metal and stone, but the very concepts that gave objects their meaning. Elven lore masters studied alongside beings whose memories stretched back to the time before the world's foundation, learning to see their own history as part of a story far grander and stranger than they had ever imagined. On this particular evening, as the season turned from summer to autumn and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, representatives from all the realms touched by the second music had gathered in the Garden of Memory for what had become an annual celebration, the Festival of New Harmony. It was not a solemn occasion, despite its cosmic significance. The mathematical beings had learned to shape themselves into forms that resembled party decorations, creating geometric patterns that pulsed with colors that had no names. The ecosystem entities had sprouted festival foods that grew directly from their consciousness, fruits that tasted like contentment, breads that carried the flavor of old friendships, wines that sparkled with the essence of shared laughter. Even the Unsinger had come, its presence no longer terrifying but oddly comforting, like the feeling of completion that came at the end of a well-told story. It had learned to manifest in a form that approximated hospitality, a great pavilion of crystallized silence where the various beings could retreat when the complexity of multidimensional communication became overwhelming. Each year, the song grows richer, observed Círdan the shipwright, who despite his great age had chosen to remain in Middle-earth to witness this unprecedented flowering of inter-realm cooperation. I wonder sometimes what the Valar make of it all. They are pleased, I think, replied Beren, who with Luthien had become a regular visitor to these festivals, though perhaps a bit overwhelmed. The music of creation was their song, but the second music belongs to all of us together. As if summoned by his words, a new presence made itself known at the festival, not arriving in any visible way, but simply becoming apparent to all who had the sensitivity to perceive it. It was ancient, beyond measure, carrying harmonies that predated not just Middle-earth, but the physical universe itself, yet its touch was gentle as a parent's hand upon a sleeping child's forehead. Eru Ilúvatar, the one who had sung all existence into being, had come to listen to the music his creation had learned to make for itself. The effect on the assembled celebrants was profound but not paralyzing. They felt awe, certainly, but also something like recognition, the way a grown child might feel when visited by a parent whose love had shaped them in ways they were only now beginning to understand. "Welcome, Father," Arianne said simply, speaking for all who had gathered. "Would you like to hear what we've been learning?" The response came not in words, but in a harmony that seemed to emerge from the very structure of reality itself. A note of such perfect receptivity that every being present knew their song was being heard, not just with divine attention, but with divine delight. And so, as the stars wheeled overhead, and the boundaries between worlds became as permeable as the space between musical notes, the assembled singers began to share the second music they had been creating. It was no longer the desperate song of defense they had begun with, nor even the joyful chorus of celebration it had become, but something new, a music of such complexity and beauty that it seemed to add new harmonies to the structure of existence itself. They sang of discovery and growth, of the joy that came from learning to communicate across impossible differences. They sang of mistakes made and lessons learned, of failures that had become the foundation for unexpected successes. They sang of love in all its myriad forms, not just the love between individuals, but the love of craftsmen for their work, of gardeners for their growing things, of storytellers for the tales that demanded to be told. But perhaps most remarkably, they sang of hope, not the desperate hope of those who cling to possibility in the face of overwhelming despair, but the mature hope of those who had learned that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever dared imagine. Hope for discoveries yet to be made, for friendships yet to be formed, for songs yet to be sung by voices that had not yet learned to harmonize. As the music reached its crescendo, Eru Ilúvatar added his own voice to the chorus, not dominating or directing it, but joining it as one singer among many. His contribution was the gift of infinite possibility, the assurance that no matter how complex the music became, there would always be room for new variation, new themes, new voices joining the eternal song. The unsinger, hearing this cosmic harmony, understood at last why it had been drawn to participate rather than destroy. The silence it represented was not the opposite of music, but an essential part of it. The spaces between notes that gave rhythm meaning, the rests that made the melody more beautiful, the promise of peaceful conclusion that made each beginning precious. And in the heart of that great song, Sam Gamgee's simple voice could still be heard, singing about gardens and friendship and the small daily joys that made the vast symphony worth preserving. For he had learned, and taught them all, that the greatest truths were often the simplest ones, that love freely given multiplies when shared, that hope grows stronger when it is tested, and that the most beautiful music is made not by perfect voices singing in isolation, but by imperfect voices learning to harmonize together. As the Festival of New Harmonies reached its conclusion, and the various beings began to return to their own realm, they carried with them the memory of that perfect moment when all existence had sung together in harmony. But they also carried something more, the knowledge that such moments would come again, that the second music was not a song with an ending, but an endless exploration of what it meant to exist together in wonder and love. The stars sang overhead, and in their light, the future stretched out like an unwritten score, waiting for the next movement to begin. And somewhere in the deep places of the earth, in the spaces between worlds, in the silence that gives meaning to sound, the music continued, as it always had, as it always would, world without end. Thus concludes this chronicle of the second music, though the song itself plays on beyond the reach of words to capture or memory to hold. For the greatest stories are those that have no ending, and the most beautiful music is that which teaches us to sing along.